Hello and welcome to this third lecture in Introduction to Biblical Cosmology. In the last lecture, we explored the modern worldview, and I was making the case that the modern worldview can be understood largely as a worldview based upon materialism that spreads via critique. It's a way of looking at reality that derives its authority from observable physical phenomena and the understanding of those observable physical phenomena. And it has spread around the world. Indeed, you could argue that this modern worldview has colonized the entire planet intellectually. It's emptied all the skies of all the gods. It has driven so much of customary, traditional, and received behavior among the various cultures of the planet off the reservation, and it's replaced it with this materialist worldview, and it is in that sense it is the basis for globalism. But yes, so that's the modern worldview. Now, in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the medieval cosmological worldview. So we're doing the same thing, just with what I would argue is the period before. We explored in the last lecture what I mean by cosmological and worldview, and so with medieval, it just means the period in between the ancient and the modern. I find it very interesting that is the name for the period. It doesn't really have its own unique name. We just call it the bit in the middle, and perhaps that reflects a bias, you might say, but I digress. So, and I thought it was actually to just acknowledge this, because it might be bothering some of you. When I say that we will be looking at medieval cosmology, it will be necessary for us, in order to understand the shared cosmological worldview of millions of people over a period of 1,000 years, to generalize. There's going to be a lot of generalization there. And when we're doing history, we're going to be generalizing, otherwise it's pretty hard to do useful history. But we're generalizing based upon patterns. There are sources of evidence that we are analyzing. We're not doing it scientifically, we're doing it historically. And when we do historical analysis, we're largely identifying patterns and then theorizing about the nature of those patterns that we observe over time. So I'm very aware that we're generalizing, but I believe that any reasonable person would acknowledge that, generally speaking, what we're going to be outlining today could be understood as the European medieval worldview. And so the main point that I will be making in this lecture is that the medieval worldview was not biblical, it was not static, and it was not inherited. And if there's any singular point that I would hope that you all would take away from this lecture, it's that we tend to receive the viewpoint in our society, in our culture, that it was the Christian worldview that was deconstructed by that modern revolution that we looked at in the last lecture. That was certainly a Christian worldview, but it was a construct. The medieval worldview was itself developed during the transition from the ancient into what became the medieval period. It's not the biblical worldview. And we're going to spend the rest of this subject after this lecture exploring that, and I'll be making that case and laying out that it truly is not the worldview of the Bible writers. The medieval worldview was a construct that was developed during the transition from the ancient to the medieval world. It also wasn't static. It changed enormously over time. And so we talked about how it was, generally speaking, I think historians would consider that Thomas Aquinas ultimately reconciled and fused together the scholastic synthesis of faith and reason, and put together what we might call the modern worldview. He sort of made it explicit and formalized it. But that then was breaking down during the 14th century, during the crises of the late Middle Ages. And so there were many changes. You can call it one thing, but it certainly changed over time as well. That's just how history works. And it was not inherited. So as I just mentioned, the medieval worldview, the medieval cosmological worldview in particular, was constructed during the late antique period, and it was largely constructed in response to the crisis of the collapse of the Roman world. And let's briefly just talk about its features, though. So the medieval cosmological worldview, it was an integrated, ordered hierarchy. I mentioned in the last lecture about the great chain of being, that it was you had God at the top, ranks of angels, humans, the infernal regions, and the animals and plants in between, I guess. That it was a totalizing worldview that comprised everything, and it was hierarchical. It was fairly stable, although it changed after time. And it was built during the collapse of the classical world, during the collapse of the Greek and Roman world. It was built by a fusion of Greek metaphysics, Roman and political legal order, and Christian theology. So it was not a direct import from the worldview of the Bible writers whatsoever. It was a fusion and a synthesis. And what we're going to do then in this lecture is the same approach that we used in the last lecture. We're going to go back and look at the collapse of antiquity, and then we will begin to develop the case that what became the medieval worldview ultimately emerged from a response to the crisis of the collapse of antiquity. So let's have a look then at the collapse of the ancient world. So this is the end of the ancient period, quite obviously. And it's something that it's usually a category. The transition from the ancient to the medieval is generally most usefully applied to Europe. However, I would argue that there were elements of a similar transition that happened in places like East Asia, fascinatingly, given that those places were so far away from each other. Maybe we can talk about that another time. Now, from the 2nd century AD onward, there'd been a series of crises in the Roman system that had weakened the economic foundations of the empire. There was debasement of the currency, rising costs, a growing burden from public liabilities, where the government had to meet expenses for public servants, and for the army as well. This led to inflation. You had immigration. Does it sound familiar? And this altered the demographics of Western Europe and the Mediterranean profoundly. So the people who were ruling the Europe in 800 AD were significantly different from the people who had been ruling it in 100 AD. As these crises progressed, urban centers generally shrank, and especially warfare in particular is very devastating for cities. Then people would either die, or they would move back to the countryside that in reality their ancestors had inhabited centuries and centuries before. And ultimately, these series of crises saw, by, let's say, the 5th century AD, the ultimate dissolution of the institutions of government. So the Roman system was a very clever system of imperial governance. It was largely defined by its system of maintaining political order, which had to do with the institutions and the offices of local elites, and then ultimately up to the imperial elite itself. It was a very, very effective system. When those institutions dissolved, that's the end of the Roman system, because they were the foundation of it. And this caused a civilizational crisis throughout the Mediterranean and Roman worlds. And in response to that crisis of meaning, that sense that the world as it had been known has disappeared, what does this mean for Christianity? What does this mean for the church? What does it mean for our cultures and our societies? That in response to that crisis, the medieval worldview was developed by scholars and intellectuals. And as that was a shared worldview across a world that had been governed by the Romans but no longer was, it largely came to be seen as shared through the Catholic Church in Western Europe. The Catholic Church, being cross-political and pan-cultural, if you like, it became the repository of the heritage of literacy, education, philosophy, and authority that had been associated with Roman governance. In that sense, in Western Europe, the Church became the Catholic Church became the custodian of civilization. If we want to define if we're willing to define civilization as the arts of governance that make urban life possible and flourishing. That was a bit clumsy, but if we think of civilization in those more traditional terms, then the church became the custodian of all the arts that made that possible. And indeed, it was within the church that we see the medieval worldview incubated because it was playing this role. So now let's just go through each of these three inputs, if you like, into what became the medieval worldview. We're going to look at Greek metaphysics, we're going to just have a look at Roman political and legal order, and then we will look at the late antique Christian theology and just get a sense of the inputs into what became this medieval worldview. Greek metaphysics largely rested on the work of two Athenian philosophers who had been alive centuries, more than half a millennium before this period. Indeed, pretty much almost a millennium, really. There's Plato and Aristotle, and of course, both of them deriving from Socrates as well. And so it's that remarkable series of philosophers that we saw in Athens in particular, which was not a large place. It did a couple of tens of thousands of citizens. It wasn't a mega city. But remarkably, we see a few generations during what some historians have called the Axial Age, who laid the foundations for what, like almost a millennium later, became a large part of the medieval worldview. It's quite remarkable. Plato largely saw an ordered and rational cosmos with heaven governing it above. He was a metaphysicist. He was okay with the heavens being above. Plato had been initiated into mystery schools in the Eastern mysteries, and he drew upon ancient cosmological traditions in his thinking. All of these philosophers were very much drawing from other philosophies and belief systems and mythologies to form their ideas. His famous idea is the theory of forms, which posited that the particular examples of things that we see down here in the world, we know what they are because there's a perfect form of them in what we might call heaven. It's this idea of divine, celestial and terrestrial correspondence. The two are connected. It's like as above, so below. Okay? And that's a really important way of looking at things, because that then got fused into the creation of this medieval worldview, where indeed there was seen as a correspondence between the governance above and and what happened below. And so this by the time of late antiquity, this had grown and developed into a rather different beast. It's called Neoplatonism. I don't need to go into any details with that there, but Neoplatonism became the foundation of the metaphysics of the medieval worldview. So, like, that's kind of important. The metaphysics just referring to realms above and below that we can't experience through our senses because they're outside the physical realm. Okay? And so the metaphysics of the medieval worldview did not come from the Bible. It came from Neoplatonism. Now, there were categories which were imported from Christianity, as we will see, but the basis was Neoplatonic. And the main point, really, of Plato's contribution to the synthesis that became the medieval worldview is his insight, his belief that reality is ordered. And once you could combine this with the Christian concept of divine governance, of God ruling, then that can come together into a worldview which is gonna sit well with populations who were well accustomed to centuries of Greek philosophy already. Aristotle's contribution to this worldview became, actually, interestingly, became more significant over time during the medieval period. And many of the early rationalists, the early advocates for, let's say, reason over faith, they during the Renaissance and before and after, they drew that idea, a lot of them, from the work of Aristotle, because Aristotle was more of an empiricist. He was more focused on nature and empirical reasoning. He saw the heavens as a series of concentric spheres. So this became the medieval worldview, the harmony of the spheres, where, if you could imagine, we've got now. There's a lot of controversy about whether medieval people believed that the earth was flat or whether the earth was round. It was known that the earth was round more widely than I think a lot of people today believe. They weren't totally ignorant of such a thing. Eratosthenes, was it, in the ancient period, who had rather accurately calculated the circumference of the earth, I think, just from memory. But what you might imagine is that there's a sphere with the earth in it, and perhaps, yes, okay, there's a disk or something similar, and then around that are these rotating spheres, that each of them having one of the planets, because the planets are moving pretty wildly around the place, and astrology was still practiced all the way through this period. And so you had these spheres rotating, and then on the outermost sphere was the fixed stars, and these were sort of like a Russian babushka doll. They were nested inside each other and rotating and spinning, and that was the cosmic picture that came out of the work of Aristotle. And the categories of these philosophies, these late antique philosophies, became the basis for the interpretation of Christian cosmology during late antiquity. So what happened was you had scholars, intellectuals, people who read, were then reading the Old and New Testament through the lens of Greek metaphysics. And that becomes the medieval worldview, which I cannot emphasize enough was not the biblical worldview. The biblical worldview was different. So now let's look a little at the Roman political and legal order. Rome provided the legal, political, and economic template for Western European societies into the modern period. So even during the founding of the United States, around about that time across Europe, you can see this neoclassical wave occurring, where people in the 18th and even into the early 19th century, they were emulating Greek and Roman political systems, architectural systems, and whatnot, because they could see that all throughout this period, ever since the fall of Rome, there's this siren song of imperial grandeur that called to the elites there, the intellectuals of Europe and its derivative colonies, and to the point where even of course the American system of government, it's not a democracy, it's a Roman republican system, which drew upon that heritage, and so that's carried through all the way through. And I think maybe even you could say when the Roman world collapsed, it's like the West never really got over it. And for a long time it tried to be recreated and rediscovered. That's a contention. You might see that as overly simplistic. That's fine if you do. And then the third aspect of this fusion to develop the medieval worldview was late antique Christian theology. Now we have to remember that by late antique, I'm really saying the 5th century AD. So it's been over 400 years since the crucifixion at this point. And so that's a long time. And so the way that the 1st century church, especially in Judea, looked at the world, their cosmological worldview, their mental categories, they've largely been lost, I think we could say, and so really the man who did the work of fusing Greek metaphysics and biblical concepts, or you might even say what had become biblical concepts. The man who did that work, so just as we talked about Thomas Aquinas establishing the medieval worldview there during and establishing scholasticism, I think the man that you could say achieved a comparable work there during the antique collapse is Augustine in the early 5th century AD. And what Augustine did is, scholars write massive tomes on this. I can't summarize it in a few seconds, but perhaps we could say that what Augustine sought to do was to supernaturalize the Roman political order. And so just because the Roman order of governance had collapsed and there was now this new world of these barbarians which had come along, that Romanitas, the dream of Rome, if you like, that system of order that provided peace and guaranteed human flourishing, that now came to be framed as a supernatural reality by Augustine. And that's a really important contribution to that medieval worldview that I keep talking about. He reinforced the great chain of being, that reality is hierarchical, above and below, and then much later this became institutionalized by the development of universities. Within the universities we can see the trivium and the quadrivium, the seven liberal arts of the medieval educational system, that reflected this way of looking at reality as hierarchical, that there was a hierarchy of these seven liberal arts that provided the basis for a sound education. And interesting that they chose the number 7. That's a cosmological number. We'll be getting to that later. And so, yes, this is the contribution there of Christian theology into what became this medieval worldview. By the 11th century, you had men such as Peter Abelard, who was a scholar, a church scholar there in the 11th century, who he was making the case by the 11th century that reason should be employed rigorously in the investigation of theology. And this, I think you can say the 11th century is a turning point where reason starts to become more prominent than faith as a basis for how to look at the world. And it was Abelard who first contested that reason was a tool by which man could know God better, and then Aquinas is the one who sort of worked it all out and fully synthesized all of that idea. Now, Peter Abelard was not an atheist, and neither was Thomas Aquinas. None of these men early on were. What they were trying to do is reform Christian scholarship. But they were doing it by arguing that Christian scholarship should, what we would call Christian scholarship, they would have just called scholarship, because, there's no Catholicism when everyone's a Catholic, right? It's like trying to explain water to a fish. It's only when you start to have people protesting, people breaking away from that, then the thing might become something you can see. So he would have just said scholarship, but they were arguing for reformation within scholarship in Europe, but the arguments that they were making were later extended by humanists into a critique of faith itself, and that ultimately led to secular rationalism and the atheist sort of climate that we have today. Now, by the High Middle Ages, this medieval worldview had become a total system of thought. It was all-encompassing. Everything could be explained by this medieval worldview. After that crisis of the 14th century, and then the introduction of Greco-Roman texts by scholars fleeing Constantinople, the rise of banking, all those things I talked about in the last lecture, this provoked the humanist reaction against the medieval worldview and began that process of critiquing it. So humanists read the Greek classics and studied nature directly, and then they were able to use reason and what they found in those texts, or by that natural observation, to then critique the scholastic worldview, to then critique the medieval worldview. Ultimately leading us to the Renaissance, the Reformation, which was a critique within Christianity about the basis of authority, and then the Enlightenment later on. And as this is why I've been making the case to you that modernity is a materialist worldview which conquers via critique. It imperializes, it drives out other worldviews by critique, because if you reduce everything to the materium, then you have no basis for arguing for anything outside of material reality. And so the people who've spent the most time investigating material reality will win, and so that's largely what we're living with. Now, as I said before, the key point that I would like to convey in this lecture, and hopefully to convince you of, is that the humanists of the Renaissance and the secularists of the Enlightenment, the ones who laid the foundation for the modern worldview, they were not critiquing and overthrowing the worldview of the Bible. They thought they were, and many people today would say that they were. But I'm with my scholarship here, with the lectures that I'm providing for you here, I'm trying to achieve a couple of things. And one of them I'm trying to achieve is to try and really illustrate and flesh out that what people think of as the Christian worldview in the modern West is pretty much the medieval worldview. It's not the ancient worldview of the Bible writers. It's not the ancient worldview of the Second Temple period. And so those humanists and secularists, they were instead critiquing and overthrowing a construct which itself had been developed during late antiquity onward, built out of Greek metaphysics, Roman political and legal order, and Christian concepts, and indeed Christian concepts that had been developed over time, in the intervening 400 years from when the Bible had been written, so not biblical. And in the next lecture, we're going to start to move into the ancient period. And we'll spend the next lecture looking at the late antique cosmological transition. That's this period of crisis during which the foundations were laid of the medieval worldview. And I hope to see you then.